Hi, this is Sarah Escovy. I believe this is my fifth reading response, and I did it over the article on worms for the assessment and evaluation class. So I found this like a really interesting article. It was all about inquiry-based learning for kindergarten students and how worms can help kids learn how to do things like distinguish between living and non-living things, as well as learn the life cycle of worms. So the article was divided into sections. The first section was a lesson based on living and non-living. And within that, there were like mini sections, little steps, which was engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. So in the first stage, engage, that was on page 60, and basically it instructed you to have a group discussion probe to find students' knowledge, like what they know from their background knowledge, and to help dispute any misconceptions about anything about worms and the difference between living and non-living things. So the next step was explore, and that was on page 61. And she talked about the three different practice techniques that students should be able to use, which was a pipe cleaner worm, a gummy worm, and then a real worm. And they were able to distinguish the differences between the three. Then in explain, she shows a comic of a worm to the class, and they discuss things that were wrong with the worm based on their exploration. So like, oh, worms don't have arms and feet and things like that. And then next was elaborate, and in this the students identified differences and similarities between the three worms that they practiced with, and then also the differences and similarities between those worms and the kids themselves. So different things like, oh, like I move and the real worm also moves, but the gummy worm doesn't move like I move. Just different things like that. The last step was evaluate, and this was done through informal assessment through discussion questions. So the teacher would just ask the kids throughout the whole thing their thoughts on it and how they were perceiving it, just to see if the students were really getting what, like, they were getting the info that needed to be taken back from the lesson. So the next lesson was the life cycle of worms, and in this it had the same steps: engage, explore, explain, evaluate, or elaborate and evaluate. So in engage, which started on 62, page 62 I mean, she first asks the class like what type of worm is more like people, the gummy worms or the real worms, and theoretically all the kids would say real worms, and you could have a discussion on why. Next, in explore, she gave the students different worms of different sizes to show that they also grow like us. So that kind of plays into their life cycle of how they're small and they get bigger, just like how humans get small and then get bigger throughout their life. In explain, she gives the students pictures of the different stages of the worm's life cycle, and she asks them to determine things like, oh, like what's the egg and what's the full grown, and just the different little stages of the worm. And then in elaborate, she asks them to cut and glue the life cycle in their journal in the correct order and try to label it as well. And in evaluate, it's like another informal assessment, basically just reviewing the journals with the kids, asking them questions on what goes where and why they put it in the order that they did. So I found this article really interesting. It was really interesting to see, honestly, the different ways that kindergarteners could learn science. The way she described it, I didn't really realize that meant that kindergarteners could do that much at such a young age. And one of the big things that I saw was when she pulled out the comic of a worm in the first lesson and asked the kids like what was wrong with it after they'd gotten to play around with the worms, asked what was wrong with the picture. I really liked how that was more of a differentiated tactic in learning. So they could use the knowledge that they learned and have discussions. I like how there was a lot of discussion as well as like hands-on. So the students kind of got an opportunity to see it from all sides. And with that also, I was really surprised and found it interesting how much she emphasized that they have to be able to both observe, handle, like personally handle with their own hands, and ask questions to help them have a deep understanding. Sorry, develop a deep understanding. Just the fact that they were able to do all of that at such a young age, and that they were able to handle the worms, and that they were able to ask such deep questions for such a young age, I thought it was really interesting.